I'm Mrs. Maurer. I am the school social worker here at MASH, and I have been here since August of 2023. But June will actually be 21 years that I have been a social worker. So this is a field that I feel really passionate and really excited about after 2 decades, and I'm excited to share a little bit about it with you today. So again, we're going to be talking a little bit about what social work is. We're going to talk about what we've kind of termed specializations, and that is essentially framework and fields within social work that you could go in and have positions in, career interests, etc. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the education and training. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the skills that are required in order to be an effective social worker. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the environments that you work in. During the course of our specializations, we'll really get into that, but we're going to touch back on it again when we get to work environments. We're going to talk about some of the job outlooks. Specifically, we're going to focus on central Pennsylvania, right? Because that's where we're all living and working right now. Maybe not forever, but this is where we are right now, as well as some of the challenges in this field, and then what kind of steps you would have to get started. Okay. Any questions so far? At any point in time, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask. Like I said, the more interactive we can make this, the better. That being said, I know it's second period, so hopefully most of you are awake by now. But okay, so talking about what social work is. So social work is, the fancy definition is that social workers help individuals, families, and groups restore or enhance their capacity for social functioning, and they work to create societal conditions that support communities in need. So that's a lot of fancy words. What social workers really do, more broadly and understanding, is working with individuals, with groups, with families, with communities to identify barriers to successful, healthy, happy functioning, and to work to create and implement strategies, resources, and skills in order to help people live whatever their best lives look like. Social work requires a lot of knowledge and work within human behavior, with human development, and with social, economic, and cultural institutions in our country and throughout the world, and the way all of these factors interact and overlap. Social workers work with people from all backgrounds to address their own needs through psychosocial services and advocacy. Social workers frequently intersect and work with people during some of the biggest challenges in their lives. Social workers often encounter and support people experiencing poverty, trauma, addiction, racism, physical illness, developmental disabilities, and many other challenges that they might face. They often work with populations who have been marginalized by society or by their families. They work with individuals to help them develop their own strategies, their own skills, and access the resources they need in order to successfully cope with and overcome. One of the things that's really special about social work is that there are core values that frame and inform and drive the way social workers develop and deliver their interventions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but this is so important because service, social justice, identifying the dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence are the framework that drive social work. So, why do we have social work? Again, the work is to promote social welfare and to help people from all backgrounds have their best functioning. So those values that we just talked about, those 6 values, bleed out and spread out into what we have as a code of ethics. Now, there are a variety of fields. Specifically, I'm thinking nursing, right, that has a code of ethics. School counselors have a framework through CASEL. A number of other medical professions have do no harm and other rules. Attorneys have ethics and rules they have to follow. But those 6 values inform a code of ethics that social workers have. That was initially developed and launched in 1960 as a 1-page document, and now, honestly, is a pretty thick booklet that they update every 5 to 10 years. So when we talk about ethics for social work, what do we mean by that? So we reference the principle of service. That means that social workers work to serve people in need and to address social problems. We talk about social justice. We are called as social workers to challenge social injustice and to work for social change on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed people. We're going to talk as we go through, especially when we get into the specializations, we're going to hear a little bit more about how those specific areas of work, as well as the education, are informed by these values and ethics. When we talk about the dignity and worth of a person, it's really, really important that social workers understand and practice respect for every person that they encounter and be mindful of cultural and ethnic diversity. So this does not necessarily mean we like everybody we encounter, right? This does not mean that we are going to love or agree with every single thing our clients do. What dignity and worth of a person means is that we find and believe that that person deserves the opportunity to have support, and also that person has the capacity to change, and that we see value in them independent of their choices or life circumstances. That goes really well into the importance of human relationships. Social workers in our code of ethics, we recognize and value the importance of human relationships, and we work to strengthen these relationships in order to enhance the well-being of individuals and communities. One of the primary components of social work is that we believe we facilitate and support change in the context of a relationship. When you are vulnerable and you are dealing with something really hard, somebody who is in charge of you or has power over you, you're not going to really feel comfortable listening to them. You're not going to necessarily make big changes in your life. But when somebody gets to know you and you feel respected, there's a much better opportunity that you're going to be receptive to how they are trying to help you and support you in their life. And along with that, integrity. It's very important for social workers to be trustworthy and uphold the mission's values, ethics, and ethical standards of the profession. And competence. That is an ethical principle that means that we have to practice within areas of competence and continuously work to develop skills. So one of the examples that I gave when I was running through this presentation with my kid last night, and she's like, well, what does that mean? What do you mean you wouldn't work with something? So for example, right now I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Pennsylvania, and I'm also a Pennsylvania certified school social worker. I do not have any specialized certifications in drug and alcohol interventions. So if you or your family needed support around that, it would be, I could talk to you about some general problem solving, I could talk to you about some general coping skills, but it would be important and valuable for me to refer you out and get you connected with a specialist. I could provide general support and help you access that resource, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to pretend that I'm a specialist in that particular part of the field. So that's, again, when we talk about competence, it's about owning what we can and cannot do. So, who do social workers support? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Can everybody see that list okay? So I think I'm going to let you take a look at that and tell you a little bit, if you're interested in my own career path and the populations that I've worked with. So based on what I've already shared about the values, about the ethics, about the call to support people in their level of need, it should be no surprise at this point that social workers are uniquely trained and positioned to help our fellow members of society who are vulnerable, oppressed, or marginalized. So as I was kind of thinking through this, I thought I'd kind of take you through the several populations of individuals that I've worked with. And there's, even within that, there's some overlap. And there's definitely bits and pieces of each of these fall into that, but several main populations. So when I graduated from my undergrad, I felt really passionately about mental health. And I got a position in the field in Cumberland Services, working with adults with serious and persistent mental health disorders who were more than likely on receiving disability payments and had been accessing mental health services for the entirety of their lives. I had several clients who had been in state hospitals for over a decade. So I worked with them in a community-based program, doing case management, so helping them make sure they were getting funding for their medications, making sure that they had a chance to get out and get their groceries. I then worked in a residential program with that same population of adults with serious and persistent mental health disorders. Now, even within that, there were individuals who had medical components, medical issues. There were individuals who were addressing challenges around their sexual or gender identity. There were individuals who also had histories of addiction. Again, the primary client base that I was working with were individuals with mental health disorders. So I worked in a residential program after the Harrisburg State Hospital closed in 2006 that was to expand and provide services for individuals who didn't have anywhere else to live. A few years after that, I worked in a long-term extended acute care psychiatric hospital program. And that was a cross between the typical inpatient psych hospital stays that were lasting 2 to 10 days and a bridge between that and state hospital stays that were often lasting many years. People were also then based in their local community, could see their families more often. After that, I transitioned, and I was really, at that point in time, really was not sure I wanted to keep working with adults. And I realized I really was interested in learning more about supporting kids, adolescents, and families. So then I worked at an outpatient children's behavioral health center. I liaisoned directly with the families, doing intakes, getting them connected with services. I worked for things on behalf of the psychiatrists and the therapists there. I then worked specifically with students, and I transitioned and worked with a program called Teen Line. And I supported mental health assessments and crisis referrals for school districts all through Cumberland and Perry counties. So that was actually one of the ways that I got connected here many, many years ago. I actually occasionally came to the high school. I occasionally came to Upper Allen. But I worked closely with Mechanicsburg Middle School and developed some great relationships there. And that was one of the things I knew. I always really liked the way Mechanicsburg Area School District did things. I'm sure that as many of you are finishing up, you might not always agree with that, but I think it's a pretty great place. And I say that having been in programming in all the other schools in Cumberland and Perry counties. So again, these were all community mental health services and community mental health focused populations. But even within that, I had students. I had individuals who also were immigrants and refugees. So I was working with students, but I was working with their parents who English was not a language that they spoke. I was working with families who had aging individuals in their households. After that, I worked at a career and technical high school as their first school social worker for a number of years. So again, the student population that I worked with was 9th to 12th graders who were working on their career and technical certifications as well as their high school diplomas. And then I'm working with 9th to 12th graders. So again, those are some specific aspects of the community that I've been a part of. But even within that, I worked with a lot of teens who were dealing with families maybe not accepting their gender or sexual identity. Certainly, both at my previous school and in this school, we've worked with many refugee families who have recently arrived in Mechanicsburg from places that they can no longer live. In all of these situations, I've worked with families, right? Because students, most cases, live with their parents or with a family member of some kind. So I'm going to ask you now, kind of talking through a little bit of what I've done, kind of seeing the populations here. Does anybody want to share any population that kind of pulls at their heartstrings? Anything that you think you might feel passionately about? You know, within this, I did volunteer work at a homeless shelter in Carlisle for a number of years and sat on their advisory board. I have a number of friends who work for the Veterans Administration. I have a friend who even specialized and ran a national program on interpersonal violence in veteran families. So there's a really, really broad and exciting range of individuals you can work with. So did anything pique anybody's interest so far? It's okay if not. Yeah. I appreciate that feedback, and we're going to talk a lot about the really, really broad range of things you can do in supporting people with mental health challenges. So thank you for that. Yeah. It's really interesting, and you know, there's a measure of independence working with adults, right? Because they're living on their own and they're making their own decisions. But working with children and adolescents, it's much earlier opportunities to intervene and provide supports. And that was one of the things that struck me the most, was realizing, okay, I had been working with clients who had had behaviors for 20, 30 years, and then I had the chance to put some supports in place so that people never developed into those behaviors. Still had a lot of challenges, but I appreciate that feedback. Children in foster care, I really appreciate that. Is fantastic. That's a very specific population that needs a lot of great people. They need people to advocate for them in court. They need people to train and support the families that house them. And they need supports for their families if they look at reunification, as well as therapy and connecting with other kids who have gone through similar experiences. So there's a lot of great opportunities in foster care. I appreciate that. Anything else?
Probably people with addiction.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, it's so interesting that the way, even just in my 20 plus years in the field, changes in the services available and the need for services with addiction have really changed. You know, when I started out in the field, marijuana was still, and THC were still obviously federally classified and scheduled drugs. We know that Pennsylvania has moved towards medical marijuana, and many states have recreational marijuana use now. Additionally, what's so interesting to think is that when I started out in the field, nobody was talking about opioid addiction, right? And when I was working in community mental health, it was still a period of time where pharmaceutical companies were allowed to come and bring food and goodies and recruit doctors to prescribe their medications. And it's only through the opioid crisis and the lawsuits against the Sackler family and the opioid industry that they really stopped even doing that with pharmaceuticals. So definitely there's more and more trends too. There's a lot of stuff, influencers, and a lot of literature and research out around sober curiosity. So yeah, addiction is such an interesting field. Lindsay. I love that, dementia. That is so great, and that is so broad. So we're going to talk a little bit about aging and gerontological social work services and about the framework of that. So that could look like supports for families, right? Supports in waiver funding to help people remain in their own homes. That could include long-term care facilities. That could involve even like the planning and design around facilities so that there are places now where there are enclosed gardens with edible plants so that if people who have dementia wander, they have a safe place to wander around in, and if they eat something bizarre, it's actually perfectly safe for them. There are ways that they have facilitated. So again, somebody with creative design helped design that in social work. So a lot of great things, and we'll talk a little bit about some of all these. I really appreciate everyone's feedback. Okay, so we're going to touch a little bit on each of these specializations. What I think is important to emphasize is that within social work, you are always wearing many hats. So just because your job description or your funding might fall under one of these, there is a good chance you are also going to deal with families. You are also going to deal with government systems. You are also going to potentially deal with mental health challenges. And one of the things that I think is the most dynamic part, every single job I've had has been different, but I have learned and brought something with it to every other job, every role, every position I've had. I often say that being a social worker makes me a better mom, and being a mom makes me a better social worker. I think about things I learned when I was right out of college in my first job that I still rely on today. So even within, so don't think that any of these are completely exclusive. The lines really, it's like watercolor, right? It all kind of bleeds together a little bit sometimes. So let's just kind of do a little bit of a recap on these, because I think this is really important. So child welfare and social work. So this is involved working with some of the most really vulnerable children and their families. They specialize, and always the goal is to strengthen and support families and help maintain a family unit. There are opportunities and times, unfortunately, where that's not possible due to neglect, due to abuse, due to other challenges, and that social workers have to be involved with coming in and helping make sure that children are safe and that have a good plan moving forward. So an example of some of the jobs within this field could be a children and youth county caseworker, a court-appointed special advocate who goes along and helps oversee some of the legal aspects, a consultant who comes in to do family group decision-making. That's running a special process with families as they identify the supports they need in order for a child to return to a home. So disability supports. Now, when I was looking at these things, it actually really pressed for developmental disabilities, but I think it's really important to not only talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities, but to make sure we touch on disabilities that are acquired or developed later in somebody's life. So social workers help both children, adults, and their parents with developmental disabilities understand the legal rights, as well as to help parents be advocates and find special services that enable their children to be as independent as possible. So social workers might be involved in advocating for access. They might be involved in programs for supporting individuals who are neurodiverse or addressing autism. Something that I want to make sure I touch on is traumatic brain injury. More as testing becomes better, more and more interventions are available, and that's something different, you know. Services for somebody with TBI versus services for somebody who might outgrow something look different. And additionally, adult services, something even like TBI, like neurodiversity, these are things that are going to be going on somebody's entire life, right? So a 5-year-old needs services, but a 55-year-old probably also needs services. So what kind of jobs might someone working in disability supports have? You could be a county caseworker with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There might be somebody who is involved in coordinating and advocating for legal supports or for financial supports for somebody with traumatic brain injuries, or somebody maybe be trained as a behavioral specialist and working individually with kids with autism. Again, a really broad range of services. So as you're hearing too, there is direct service where you're working directly with somebody. There is more case management services where you are working and bridging the gap between people and resources. And there's also advocacy and policy where maybe you're meeting with the decision makers and working on things from that aspect. So it's important to think about these different layers. That's also part of social work philosophy, but we didn't have time for that today. So aging and gerontological social work services. So social workers can also link adults, older adults, with services that help them live independently and as healthfully and safely as long as possible with dignity, thereby maximizing their quality of life and participation in society. It focuses on physical, psychological, social, and economic aspects of daily living. So that might be some casework with the area office on aging. That might involve going out and doing assessments with protective services. That might be coordination of admission for long-term care. And we're going to talk a little bit about these as well. But two I want to touch on because it's a great overlap between older adult services and medical social work is palliative care as well as hospice care. So palliative care would be long-term pain management, comfort, a disease that's probably not going to ultimately lead to someone's demise, but they are going to have to deal with it for the rest of their lives. And hospice social work. So hospice focuses specifically on supporting an individual, their family, and community through the death and dying process when a diagnosis is terminal. So interestingly, both of these, aging and gerontological services are not something that ever really piqued my interest, but I have a number of close friends who absolutely adore working in these fields. I have folks who have worked at a variety of long-term care facilities. They absolutely love working with the older adults that they help coordinate admissions for. And I have a number of really close friends who work in hospice, and they love being able to walk alongside people during some of the most challenging periods of their lives. So again, those are not something I would ever really be interested in, but some people have a really great heart for that. So again, these specializations are the meat. This is going to be the longest part of the presentation. I promise you guys that. And I really appreciate everyone's engagement. I don't see any phones out. Thank you so much. So healthcare social work. So healthcare social work is one of the oldest aspects of social work. So think being around since the 1900s, social workers have worked to help people maintain their health. Obviously in the 1900s versus in the 2020s, that looks very different. So they help people address the social factors that impact their health as well as the physical and financial factors. That can also look like planning or administrating in a hospital and healthcare setting. That can conduct research, develop programs, and administer programs. So hospital social work can be a really broad thing. That can involve people supporting discharge planning from a hospital. So let's say you end up in an intensive care unit because you have a car accident and you're not sure if your insurance is going to pay for you to go to physical therapy. A social worker would help develop that discharge plan. As I mentioned earlier, palliative care and hospice care have intersections with health care. Some other very specific healthcare related social work things. There is transplant programs all over our country. There are special challenges with helping wait for a transplant. That is a very, very hard, long wait, and that's a special line of support. Another long-term physical health thing is dialysis, so renal care, so individuals in kidney failure who need to go on a regular basis, and that often impacts their ability to work, that can impact their mental health. That is a specific social worker role. Neonatal intensive care units, so individuals supporting access to the baby. So let's say a mother comes in, has a traumatic delivery, and the baby needs a lot of long-term follow-up care. The families typically don't always understand how they can get an oxygen tank at home, how they can get nursing, how they can get physical therapy down the line if the baby needs to meet milestones. That's something a social worker would help coordinate. Oncology and pediatric oncology. So providing support for individuals who are fighting cancer. You know, when we talk about pediatric oncology, would you believe there's an entire team of social workers at the Four Diamonds Fund for Penn State Hershey. So individuals with that not only develop plans and aftercare and treatment support and coordination for families that are facing cancer. There's also social workers who just manage some of the programmatic things and graduates of the program. There's social workers that address and make sure that the family doesn't have any funding issues, that the family has a place to stay if they need to. So a lot of different things. So again, that's one of the things where we see an overlap with some of those other things. And within healthcare certainly as well, there's an overlap with mental health. So when I worked on an inpatient psychiatric unit, it was embedded within a medical hospital. So individuals who were there for about a month to 6 months, right, they were going to need blood work in the meantime. They were going to need physical health interventions in the meantime. Oftentimes there was a strong overlap and they might not have addressed their physical health while they were struggling with their mental health. So again, when we think about sort of overlaps, wearing lots of hats as a social worker. So school social work, obviously this one is near and dear to my heart, but school social workers function as a connection between home, school, and community services. They work with students around emotional development and educational needs. Most practice in public or private settings, but even within that, there's some flexibility. So obviously here and now, I work within a public school, but they do have social workers at a lot of the cyber charter schools, which is really interesting. Kind of trying to connect with kids when they're never ever coming into a building can be challenging, I would imagine. The Capital Area Intermediate Unit has social workers that provide consultation and support for the private schools in central Pennsylvania. And even though the roles are different, even in our therapeutic emotional support program on the 100s hallway, Ms. Gingrich is a social worker. So she works in an educational setting, but providing mental health services. So. Oh, sorry, we're going back. We were talking about substance use. So social workers can help individuals and families and communities find ways to address and recover from substance use. And again, they provide an ecological perspective that focuses on the client and their experiences with their family, their experiences with their neighborhood environments, their experiences with their work environments, and community support systems, as well as cultural attitudes and policies. So we talk about cultural attitudes and policies. That was what I was referencing earlier when we talked about marijuana and THC products being available in a different way over many decades. When we talk about the way medication is prescribed. So social workers provide support in treating specific addiction, but also do case management, group and individual therapy, family counseling, and advocacy. So for example, that might be a therapist in an inpatient rehabilitation setting. There might be a therapist, somebody working in a sober living program. That might be an ongoing case management. When I worked for the hospital, there was a whole case management unit called Maternal Assistance Program, and that was a set of case managers who specifically worked with mothers who were pregnant and or parenting and were overcoming addiction, right? So you talk about the physical health needs, the financial health needs, and the social health needs. So again, that was a very specific role that was addiction funded and treated, but certainly overlapped with physical health, with financial things as well. Okay, So community organizing, advocacy, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the keystones of social work practice. Social work advocates champion the rights of individuals and communities with the goal of achieving social justice. So historically, social workers have been community organizers. They've responded to forces that have created inequality in our society. So one of the examples would be social workers who work alongside a political action committee to advocate and help determine legislation or help write and inform the legislation, and then come out to the communities and listen to the feedback from the families and the individuals who are impacted by that legislation. I was just at a network meeting a few months ago, and an individual who works for NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness, but because the word mental illness isn't used as much anymore, they just go by NAMI. But this person was charged with developing programs in schools and convincing schools to bring NAMI in. So that was somebody who, even though it was a mental health agency, or mental health directed, it was an agency that was providing and organizing community support. So I thought that was a really neat intersection. Really closely related to that is policy and political social work. So social workers are also charged with analyzing the policies, programs, and regulations to see what is most effective. So they identify social problems, study needs and related issues, and conduct research. Many social workers move from activism into elected office. So the programs that social workers rely on are often funded through government mandates or are directed or included by governments. So it's just important to be aware of that impact. For example, many years ago, mental health services were not covered and reimbursed at the same rate as physical health services. So there was a lot of push in Washington, D.C. for parity in insurance reimbursement so that people could access mental health services through their insurance benefits the same way they were accessing physical health services. So justice and corrections. So social workers often have strong overlaps in justice and corrections. They can be found in courts, in juvenile detention centers, in rape crisis centers, in correctional facilities. So some of the examples and jobs somebody might have would be like a juvenile justice probation officer. It might be a counselor in one of the specific programs like Justice Works that targets problematic behaviors or behaviors that kids may have gotten criminal charges for. Residential counselors and programs. At least the state correctional institutions in Pennsylvania employ social workers as therapists. When I worked at the hospital, there was a really neat program in mental health where they employed forensic case managers, and they worked with an intersection of people who had significant mental health disorders, but they also had engaged in criminal behavior, often as a result of their mental health disorders. So there was legal consequences, but they also needed to get that mental health treatment, and they worked and helped connect them with programs that sometimes their charges could be lessened or even wiped away if they accessed the appropriate treatment. Okay, this is the last specialization, then we're going to move on to education. So, international and immigrant social work. Again, that was just really diverse because I wanted to make sure we talked about all the different ways. That can involve direct services in communities, refugee camps, hospitals and schools, as well as supporting the efforts of non-governmental organizations and nonprofit organizations. So in central Pennsylvania, that would look like perhaps case management or advocacy for a resettlement agency that might involve specific therapeutic interventions. Our Capital Area Intermediate Unit has a social worker who partners directly with their ELD program and provides consultation and resource coordination for students who are newcomers to central Pennsylvania. So again, this is one of those things when we talk about politics and a direct overlap. Changes in federal funding certainly impact the grants that would fund programs like these. So again, just things that we think about when we're talking about these things. So research and training and teaching, I think, is really relevant to consider as well. When we talk about all this, how do we know all this? How do we know these theories? How do we know what works or what doesn't work? It takes research and examination over the years and then instructing people in those things in order to make that happen. While social work is technically an art, it's a soft science, it also is a research-based science. And we really, in what we do, we want to know why we do it, and we try to have it be evidence-based, right? So when I sit down and I talk with people, I'm not just shooting the breeze, right? I'm thinking about evidence-based interventions and theories that have been proven to work. I am also just chit-chatting and catching up about your day, but I have to make sure, because competence is one of my values, that I'm using evidence-based interventions when I'm working. So I know this is a younger group, but Brene Brown, who is a researcher and author, is actually also a social worker, and she teaches in social work. So that is a great example of research. And again, mental health clinical. I do want to make sure we touch on that. Clinical social workers are one of the biggest groups of mental health services providers in the United States. They provide services in all different kinds of settings: rural, urban, individual, family, group, etc. And in many cases, they're the only licensed provider of mental health services in a community. There are so many different opportunities for mental health services. So that could be something like community-based case management. That could be someone who goes into schools and provides consultation or mental health assessments. That could be inpatient or outpatient group therapy work. That could be individual therapy in a private practice. That could be working for an insurance company to make sure that the mental health services that people need are funded. Okay. Any thoughts on the specializations that we've talked to? Thanks, guys. I appreciate your patience. That was the bulk of it. I promise we're going to move on after that.
Which one was like the one-on-one counseling?
Right. So within a lot of those, there's the opportunities for one-on-one counseling, right? So mental health and clinical social work has one-on-one counseling. When you are working in aging or gerontological services, you might be doing direct work with somebody. If you're working in substance use, you might be doing direct work with somebody as well. So, yeah, that's a great question. Anything else so far?
I know you said that federal appropriation depends on like the specialization, the funding, but where do you kind of see the whole future of social work as a whole with recent decreases in federal funding?
That is such a good question. I mean, social work has, so that was specifically those, like those grant-funded positions, right? So like a grant-funded position for resettlement funds. And if resettlement funds are capped off, then that's no longer available. You know, I think social work has been around for well over 100 years, and social work existed informally, driven by sort of nosy neighbors and church groups prior to being formally established as a practice and something that was funded by the groups. So there will always be challenges in society, and there will always be people that are passionate about coming together and solving that. I think that the profession will exist for a long time. The scope of insurance reimbursement we'll have to see. Most private insurance companies do take their cues from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So if there's any changes with that in coming years, it will be interesting to see. Typically, public funding, such as Medicaid, is something that pays for a lot of these services, as well as county mental health, which again, those are different kinds of state funding. So it'll just be really interesting to see, but the profession will certainly exist. Where the money comes from still will be determined, but I think some things as well are, you know, universal. So we'll see what happens. That's a good question. It's a wait and see as well.
So like if you're working as like a social worker in CNI lab with reimbursement with like insurances, specifically with like medical assistance, would that come directly from CMS or would that come from like the state, like, depending on what?
Such a good question. So the state of Pennsylvania takes the money they receive from Medicaid, and then let's see if I can break this down a little bit. So there's the money here at the federal level, right? And then it comes down to the states, and then the states, even now, determine how they'll administer it. So the state of Pennsylvania sends it out to Medicaid, but within Medicaid, you pick a physical health HMO and behavioral health HMO, right? So within the first like 60 days or something that you have Medicaid, it's just a Medicaid card, but very quickly it's like UPMC for you or Geisinger Plus Health Plan Gold or something like that. And then there is a behavioral health HMO that manages the behavioral health benefit. It used to be a company called CBH&P. Now for most of Pennsylvania, it's a company called Perform Care. So it is administered already by the states and how they choose. And honestly, when they do, so there's some federal funding, But what do we hear about in June and is a big nightmare right before the end of June every year? The Pennsylvania state budget. So the Pennsylvania state budget determines how, from Pennsylvania taxes and from Pennsylvania funds, how they administer that. Does that answer your question at all? Good. These are awesome questions. I really appreciate it. Oh my gosh, I hope this, oh my gosh, I don't know that this was actually a white marker. Sorry about that. Mr. Leonard, put that on my tab. Okay, so education. So in the state, again, we're just going to talk about the state of Pennsylvania today because that is where we are and that is what is relevant. So bachelor's, master's, and doctoral, we'll just breeze through each of those real quick. I do have both a bachelor's and a master's degree in social work. A BSW or bachelor's degree is the minimum requirement for most social work positions. It prepares you for generalist practices such as casework, helps you learn the strategies initially for engaging with clients, and focuses on, I was thinking back through some of the coursework that I took in my bachelor's program. So that was like introduction to human behavior and introduction to social welfare. So understanding the history of social services. And then, looking at the next program would be a master's degree, a master's of social work, that helps prepare graduates for more specialized services. That would be helping you form higher level clinical assessments, taking on supervisory roles, understanding and really leaning into research. So when I did my master's program, some of the courses I took were on policy and advocacy. I took courses that were specialized on services for individuals with developmental disabilities and specialized research on human sexuality. So in order to maintain a license in the state of Pennsylvania, you are required to participate in continuing education. It is like that for anyone with a license. So hairdressers and cosmetologists who have licenses, undertakers who have licenses have to participate in continuing education. So I'm required to do 30 hours every 2 years, and that includes specifically several hours on ethics, on suicide prevention, and on child abuse awareness. And additionally, certifications. Again, so there may be specific certifications around substance abuse. I know that was one of the things we talked about. I'm not exactly sure on that. I have a certification. So Pennsylvania previously had home and school visitors, but then they recognized school social work as a profession in 2022 and cemented that in the legislation in 2022. So I have, through the Department of Education, rather than the Bureau of Social Workers and Therapists and Counselors, I have a certification as a school social worker. Okay, so real quick, what do we think might be important? What kind of skills or do you think you would need to bring to the table as a social worker if you were going to pursue this career? Empathy, good. I saw your hand too. Patience, I love that. Other thoughts that might be important? Communication, definitely. Okay, so you guys are like spot on what I was thinking about and talking about. So again, communication, thank you for highlighting that. The ability to listen and communicate effectively with the clients and the families you support. So empathy and compassion, acknowledging the feelings and the reality of other people. You might not have experienced exactly what other people have experienced, and that's okay. But being able to be vulnerable and tap into the part of yourself that has gone through hard things and to understand what the experience has been like for you to navigate challenges and respect that these people are going through challenges as well. Cultural competence, which requires working effectively with people from a diversity of backgrounds. That might mean ethnic diversity, gender and sexual identity diversity, their income, their culture, their value systems. Social workers are charged to have unconditional positive regard. Do you have to like or agree with everything your clients do? No, but you must treat them with the utmost dignity and understand that they deserve your support. So problem solving, helping clients navigate challenging situations and helping them find solutions. Part of what social work does is teaching and believing people that they are capable of developing their own solutions. So I remember when I started out, just again, how old I am, this was when people made phone calls. They didn't just text things or sign up on a website. And so when there were clients who were putting off making appointments or taking care of things that need to be taken care of, I remember sometimes it would be something like sitting there with somebody while they're doing the phone call. Sometimes that would mean practicing with somebody doing the phone call. Could I have sat in my office and made the phone call for them? Absolutely. But that wouldn't have been empowering and teaching them. Sometimes that was me dialing it and putting it in their hand and them reading through a script that we had rehearsed. But again, the goal was to support their independence and help them realize that they were capable of this. So again, advocacy, fighting for your clients and for their rights. Patience, I'm so glad you highlighted that. Change and growth do not usually move in a straight direction, and there's usually a lot of hiccups on the way. I don't know about any of you, but I've certainly not always nailed everything the first time I've tried it, and most times your clients aren't going to get that either. And one of the things that I want to put up here that is so important in social work, as well as in any helping profession really, is boundaries. So professional boundaries are the limits that define the nature and the scope of our relationships with the clients that we support. It always must remain professional, and that helps us avoid exploitation. So we are not ever friends with our clients in social work. We do not have relationships with our clients outside of our professional relationships. Okay, any thoughts on any of that so far? I'm going to go through work environments pretty quick because I think we touched on a lot of that when we touched on the specializations, and I am probably pretty heavy on my time right now. So when we talk about work environments, we like I said, we included that with our specialties. But there's nonprofit organizations. That could be, one of the places I worked was a residential agency that was nonprofit. I worked for a healthcare system that was nonprofit as well. If you work in fundraising, that's nonprofit. Government or county or state workers. So there's county casework, there's state level aid work, and there's federally funded caseworkers, such as working for Social Security Administration. Fun fact, long before I was born, my mother was a social worker and she worked for the Social Security Administration. So private practice, that's where a big bulk of social workers work. I have a number of friends who own their own businesses and are very successful providing individual and family therapy. Something that is growing in the community is concierge healthcare, where people pay a big fee up front and then the healthcare provider doesn't bill their insurance companies and can do some things outside the realm. Sometimes social workers are embedded in those environments as well. So again, schools and universities, we talked about teaching, we talked about school social work, but even counseling services within universities. And again, healthcares or agencies, that could involve hospice, that could involve community mental health centers, that could involve hospitals. Okay, so some things to know and some things to think about going forward. So the job outlooks for a social work career. So it's important to be cognizant of what the demand is and what the setting is. So that is very dependent on your time and your region, right? So when I started off in central Pennsylvania 21 years ago, and I was putting out all kinds of applications for all kinds of entry-level jobs, versus being 21 years in the field, having more degrees, having more licensure, having more certifications, and now I get the inquiries on LinkedIn, right? So again, what's in demand? There have been times that there's been a glut on the market of employees. Now we know there's a lot of conversation about a mental health crisis in our country, especially post-COVID. So there are a lot more opportunities for jobs, right? We all know that there's wait lists for a lot of mental health services. So again, that's just an example of how the setting and the demand impacts the availability of jobs. So when we talk about salary expectations, here's the thing that I think is really important to know. $1 does not equal $1, right? So this is very much dependent on the setting. Someone who works for a nonprofit is going to have a different income and outcome than somebody who works for private practice. But like I said, $1 doesn't necessarily equal $1. Someone who works for a nonprofit or in the public sector is going to have a very different compensation package, okay? I have had friends who have worked as consultants or in private practice say, oh my gosh, I make so much money, blah, 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 blah. And I say, okay, how much is the healthcare? Oh, well, they don't include healthcare. So I actually had to pay $8,000 last year for my healthcare. And I'm like, that's a lot of money. I'm like, what about time off? Oh, well, you have to take unpaid time if you want to have time off. Okay, what about your retirement match? Oh, we don't have any of that. Okay, whereas you look at something who works in a public sector, right? Those things are all going to be part of a bargaining agreement or a compensation package. So you might not see as much money in your salary, but you're going to be putting money into a retirement account. That company is going to be helping pay for your health insurance. So again, think about those things. People sometimes say, oh, I don't know if I'd want to do that because I have certain expectations in my lifestyle. I'm here to tell you that as a social worker, you will make what you need to make. And again, it's going to depend on where you live, but you'll be able to live comfortably. One of the things I decided I wanted to relate it to is like this. You probably aren't going to be able to stay at the White Lotus, but you can probably go together with a group of friends and get a beach house for a week or two, right? So again, just kind of being aware of what your expectations and what your personal needs are, I think is really relevant. And then satisfaction, what matters to you? I think on a regular basis, I never would have been happy crunching numbers. I never would have been happy trying to sell supplies or bank accounts or things like that. That's not something that ever would have worked for me. So thinking about what's important to you. So challenges, the emotional impact. Social workers work with people who are experiencing some of the hardest times of their lives. And it is hard to sometimes let go of that. People that you encounter and support are sad, they're angry, and they're vulnerable. So we used to call it burnout, now we call it compassion fatigue. You have long hours, heavy caseloads. You have to be consciously and constantly vigilant about your own personal wellness, your own personal mental health, your physical health, and how you have those boundaries. So one of the things, for example, for me is I don't give students my personal phone number. I don't give clients my personal phone number. I never have. I don't plan to ever start. Technology has changed. Certainly in 20 plus years, there were not smartphones when I started working. So now I use third-party messaging systems that are confidential and approved by schools and by nonprofit organizations and can be documented and seen. So that's a way that I have some separation, but I'm still accessible and able to support the families and kids I work with. And again, safety concerns, it is important to know when you are dealing with individuals with challenges, you may be going into home environments that are challenging. Individuals might have challenges making healthy choices. They might be in places where a lot of people are not making healthy choices. So I want to emphasize, though, that grave and serious dangers are very, very rare. A lot of uncomfortable circumstances are very, very common. That is something you can adapt to and develop skills around. In the job interview I had a group job interview with the other caseworkers for the first position I had, and this girl who was very direct looks at me across the table and says, "How do you feel about filth?" And I was like, wow, that's quite a question. And I came up with some creative answer. And then by my second day on the job, I knew exactly what she meant. And I had to just make choices about the kind of shoes I wore when I went into somebody's home, things like that. So again, being open-minded and adapting. So real quick, I just would really, really emphasize the value of internships, the value of any kind of service learning or volunteering that you do. Networking, there's professional organizations such as the National Association of Social Workers, there's state chapters of each of those, and then even within that, there's substance abuse professional organizations, there's school social work professional organizations, and social media creates a lot of informal networks. So like during COVID, when there wasn't a formal organization for Dauphin County where I was working at the time, I joined the Facebook group for like Lancaster, Lebanon school social workers because nobody knew how to be a school social worker during a lockdown. So again, making sure you're not burning your bridges because the community is small enough and the world is small enough, especially with electronics and things being instantly communicated, that people you don't agree with professionally, you still want to be respectful to. So again, short and long-term plans, don't rule out education, don't rule out opportunities, definitely go for any licensure.